Welcome, everybody. Obviously, you know that this is the cool group because we're here talking about games. And I think what's one of the interesting things, my name is McDonald. I'm a group vice president and Gartner fellow from Gartner. I think one of the most interesting things as we were having the meetings and calls before to have the panelists introduce themselves to each other is that the whole notion of gaming and applying game techniques has radically changed going forward. I don't know how many of you remember back in the software quality movement, probably about 15 years ago, the whole notion of gaming and kind of having a bounty, if you will, on software defects was like one of the best practices out there. And unfortunately, that practice died. And I think one of the reasons it died was relative to a Dilbert cartoon, which really emphasizes kind of the dark side of gaming. There's Dilbert and Wally are talking to each other, you know, over a cup of coffee and what they're going to do. And as the panels move forward, they talk, well, what do you think about this whole notion of paying a bounty on finding software bugs? And they comment about how it's kind of interesting. And then Dilbert asks Wally, well, what are you going to do this afternoon? And then the last panel, Wally says, I'm going to code myself a minivan. Gaming's moved a lot more from that kind of very simple notion to be incredibly complex and really reflecting what I believe is one of the most fundamental and deep changes that are happening relative to technology, which is technology now makes behavior addressable and intrinsic motivations addressable in ways that we never could have imagined even 3 or 4 years ago. So if you could please put your hands together and join me with our panelists. I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And one of the things we do want to do is we'll talk for just a few minutes, and then we want to open the floor up to questions on an ongoing basis. So if you have an idea, an insight, a question that you want to ask, you know, please go ahead and storm the microphones, and we'll make this a much more interactive panel as we move forward. So Jason, do you want to start?
Sure, love to. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Jason Averbook, Chief Executive Officer of an organization called Knowledge Infusion. Knowledge Infusion is a company that helps HR organizations, whether we're working with the CIOs or the CHROs or VPs of HR, understand how to best leverage technology. And whether it's moving from ERP legacy to the cloud, or whether it's thinking about how to get employees and the workforce engaged in an ongoing basis, all of our work is in that area. So great to be here and look forward to sharing some feedback and best practice throughout.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josh Kramer. I run a group called the LeapFrog Group, and we work with entire leadership teams in the C-suite, if you will, on both identifying growth opportunities in their businesses and helping their businesses grow. That's very often looking inside the organization, sometimes looking outside the organization. Gamification is a key tool that we use in our business, both in motivating the enterprise and ultimately motivating the end customer. And it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Terrific. Ritu?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ritu Riyat. I'm Senior Wellness Program Manager with Blue Shield of California. And I work on just building innovative and strategies around health programs for our employees and just engaging them to be responsible for their health and using gaming and social media as a tool to get them involved.
So to kind of get us started off, wondering if, Josh, we were talking earlier before you had an example of an application of gaming techniques and gaming technologies that you had worked on that had produced some business results to have answer, I think, a question that many of us have, which is kind of what's the return on these investments, what are possible through applying these techniques, please.
Yeah, so I mean, more looking at the consumer space just for a second, Microsoft Bing had a rewards program, has a rewards program, and when they launched that program, it was all about stuff. Do searches, get stuff. And that's an incredibly extrinsic reward for doing your searches, and one of the most important things in gamification that you'll hear almost as a buzzword is intrinsic motivation. So you have to ultimately be delivering intrinsic value in exchange for whatever it is that the user's behavior will deliver. And so what we did together with Bing was we basically relaunched that program as an intrinsic program. Bing Rewards is now Bing Membership Center. It's a discovery tool on Bing, and it helps you learn more about how to use Bing effectively. There is still a redemption feature. It's no longer physical goods. It's now digital. It's now gift cards. But when you speak about an engagement loop, to use a gaming term, your goal is really to keep people engaged with intrinsic value and ultimately get them when they get to the edge of that loop and they might be trying to exit it, that's where you sprinkle in a little extrinsic value to get them sort of that, get them back in line, so to speak. And actually, looking at the numbers, we've seen anywhere from 30 to 50% increase in engagement, increase in retention in users on Bing through this program by helping them discover how to use Bing more effectively and keeping them in the program. Redemption is an important part because you want to keep them in the loop and you want them using that full loop, but it's sort of amazing to see the numbers.
Terrific. Ritu, you're talking about applying gaming to a different dimension than kind of intrinsic rewards in terms of wellness. Curious as to what some of your observations are and what really works in this environment.
Yeah. So we're kind of moving away from the standard wellness approach, which we call Wellness 1.0. I'm sure many of you have seen it. You fill out a wellness assessment, you go online, have some health coaching done, read some material, answer questions, or maybe even get some telephonic coaching. And I don't know about you, but that's pretty passive for me. And I'll answer the questions to get my rewards, to get my discounts, but I'm done. I'm not changing my behavior. I'm not eating my fruits and vegetables. I'm definitely not running, a marathon or 5 miles or whatnot. So we wanted to move more towards using gaming to engage people and involve people by leveraging some of these intrinsic motivators that we're talking about, but giving people small incremental goals. And for example, one of the games that we implemented is a team-based step challenge. And people work together, they build teams. It could be their colleagues sitting right next to them, or it could be colleagues in another office. And they kind of work with them virtually, supporting one another to meet step goals that they've created for themselves, but there's no goal that they need to meet in order to complete the program. They just need to participate in the program. And what we found is they're increasing their physical activity. We didn't tell them to walk 17,000 steps. You could walk 10 steps and still complete the program. But they're being motivated with the support of their colleagues, their peers, as well as seeing their numbers on the leaderboard, seeing their teams beating other teams, and they're wanting to increase their physical activity.
Terrific.
So I was introduced to gaming at a young age. How's that?
Cool.
When you actually think about gaming into the workforce, it's a whole different dimension than some of the consumer type areas that we talk about. As a 10-year executive, has anyone heard of PeopleSoft? Mm-hmm. Good, I'm in the right audience. As a longtime executive of PeopleSoft, one of the things I was responsible for in 2002, and those were the eras of dial-up modem. Does everyone remember that? Dial-up modem. Was helping get people excited about enrolling in benefits. Now, who at that time, enrolling in benefits, that's 10 years ago, big deal. What we did is we started a game. Now, it wasn't called gamification then. It was about engagement and how to get people using technology. But what we did is we said for the first 500 people that enrolled in benefits online, we did this internally at PeopleSoft, you'd get a sweatshirt. And the sweatshirt said, I'm one of the first 500. We opened it up at midnight. I logged in at 6 a.m. By 6 a.m., all 500 sweatshirts were gone. For the 7 years I was there before we actually continued that, as we continued through the process, I saw the sweatshirts every day and said, wow, I missed it. I missed that opportunity. And really, that's sort of the earliest form of gamification tied to technology that I was involved in. It wasn't called gamification that we're calling it today, but it was about engagement. And one of the things I learned at a very early age was that the best way to get people to play games like that is to embed it into a process that they're already doing. If you think about the boring benefits enrollment process, or the boring change the address process, or the boring I'm getting married process. Well, not that. But I mean,
wait, I gotta look at your. Okay, yeah.
Don't tell my wife.
Be married for long after this.
Process. What can I do to make it more interesting, and what do I do to drive engagement? It's involving some sort of a game. Even at PeopleSoft early on, our first intranet. How many of you have intranets? Flat intranets with links. We hid what are called Easter eggs. Is everyone familiar with that? You go out and search little contests to get people using these tools. So gaming's come a long way, but it goes way back. And what's really important to think about is that it all drives, and it's all driven from, how do I get people engaged? And if you think about it, most HR processes, which are boring as heck, you need as much engagement as possible.
Great. So each of our panelists have touched on one of the different aspects associated with gaming. The t-shirts as a form of badging, the closed loop or rewards redemption piece, the behavior piece, and seeing yourself on a leaderboard, which is all terrific. So let me play the role of crusty old executive. And I remember when I used to be leading change initiatives, we would say, well, why don't we give people an incentive, to do whatever this particular change happens to be? And there would always be somebody, generally with the letter F in their 3-letter acronyms, who would say, well, why are we going to do that? We shouldn't be paying people to do their job. That's their job. So how does gamification kind of get out of that notion? I mean, because after all, people are supposed to register for their health benefits. If they don't, they lose it. We're all supposed to be, healthier and et cetera. So what is different about this that makes that degree of rewards and stuff that kind of avoids this notion of saying, you have to pay me to do everything that I'm supposed to be doing as part of your normal job?
Go ahead.
I think one of the things that's really important to remember about gamification, this is not always about getting an extrinsic reinforcement for your intrinsic action, right? So gamification is about, gamification is not a word either, funifying the experience, right?
Wow, that's a better word. I can just see going to the board, I want to funify you.
That's right. So it's about creating in some cases it's a community, it's collaborative, in other cases it's competitive, and you talking to the old stodgy executive, these things exist. Sales organizations are competing at the local level, at the regional level, at the national, at the global level. When you have a sexual harassment training, just speaking to the HR side of things, there are all sorts of incentives that are in place to make sure that you go and do those trainings. So you just have to identify those and point them out and say, listen, we're gonna build a slightly newer structure, a 2.0-ish structure around these incentive systems that already exist, these communities and collaborative momentums that already exist. And that's, really from talking to executives all the time, that is an objection. And all you have to do is show them what's already happening.
Okay.
How many of you go do things based on points that you get? Whether it be stay in hotels, take certain airlines, shop at certain grocery stores, go to certain gas stations. Okay, those points are valuable, right? But how much are they really worth per point? Really not much. You just do it because, at least for me, it's funified. Maybe.
You were here
Jason,
when that
that's
word
cool.
was coined.
Maybe funified. But when you think about that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to drive repeat actions. We're trying to drive engagement. And when you think about that question of when you go to a CEO or something and say, what gamification or social, as we make business cases, those are the last words we would ever use with crusty old guy here. We would never use those words. We would talk about Mr. or Miss CEO, stop innovation. Try to get them to think about innovation. Get them to think about collaboration tied to innovation and see if they're going to be hands up to that with the stop sign as much as they are hands up to gamification. So when you think about that, innovation is perpetual, right? It's always on. This isn't like a module in the old software era where we stood it up and then we forgot about it until an upgrade was needed. It's perpetual beta. The only way to keep people coming back, just like you to airlines and you to grocery stores, is by making it engaging and giving something back, even though it's got very little value. So when you think about that, the way to make that case is Mr. or Miss CEO, by having this there, they're going to see your message out to the organization every day about alignment. Mr. or Miss CEO, they're going to see your message every day out there about how you want them to think, how you want them to treat customers, how you want them to think internally as employees. That's what's going to get them coming back to sites. That's what's going to drive those things, are those little invaluable yet valuable rewards that keep us doing things. That's how you make the case to a CEO, not by using the words gamification or social.
Or funify.
Or funify.
Funify.
Yeah, and I think for us, being in the wellness world, everyone thinks of games as being fun. How many of you think of how many of you think of health as being fun? Having to go to the gym, it's almost like a chore. There's a couple of us. I'm one of them. I think health is fun. I love to go out for a run and a bike ride. But for most people, being healthy is a chore. You know, having to pick the vegetables over the shakes is a chore. So what we're trying to do is, in a sense, funify health, and a way to do that is with games and using the game approach. The other point I want to touch on is that incentives go beyond just the tangible monetary rewards, and that's something that we're really looking into. Like I was saying, you have the badges, you have the leaderboard. We have our special edition, our program is called Wellvolution, so we have our special edition Wellvolution gear, Wellvolution sweatshirts and iPod shuffles, which we give to people if they're the top steppers or if they achieve certain health goals. And we find that these intrinsic motivators and extrinsic motivators are stronger than just the monetary rewards. So for us, having a hybrid model has been very successful.
Okay, terrific. So we're about 15 minutes into the panel. Anybody have any questions or comments? Could you please come up and use the microphones?
Thank you. The question I have is for Josh. You mentioned that you saw a 30 to 50% increase in engagement using intrinsic rewards. Do you have any data points about that increase in engagement in other industries, and also how do you keep up that engagement?
So good question. So the first question was data in other industries. So we were talking about this earlier. When you are gamifying or funifying, you're going to essentially address a certain dynamic in an existing audience, and every gamified experience is going to be completely different. And so in a national sales organization, you're going to handle it one way. When you're dealing with consumers, you're going to do it another way. And so there certainly is data within other industries, but it's so broad to talk about verticals, because you have horizontals too. You have, whether it's compliance training, whether it's wellness, whether it's signing up for benefits. Every single one of these things can be gamified, and so we can certainly talk offline about what the numbers would be in another consumer experience or in another enterprise experience. But you can. I don't want to throw random numbers out there, but you can assume that if you're gamifying something right, you're going to get anywhere between a third to 50% improvement in what the performance is going to be. But it really depends on the environment. You may be gamifying something that's already gamified. It's just not formalized. And sales organizations is my favorite example of that, if it's not obvious. And the second question, do you remember the second question? Sustaining the engagement. Thank you. Sorry. So on sustaining the engagement, so that is actually, Jason was talking about this, you're never done, right? It's always about what is the, what's the progression through my engagement loop? What percentage of my users have proceeded past a certain level? Every engagement loop is going to have an implied leveling system in it, where you're going to have your pro users who are going to represent probably 60 to 80% of your engagement, but they're going to only represent 15 to 20% of your user pool. And then there's everybody else. And you're really designing the game for the everybody else. So you need to be conscious of that and sort of normalize for it in your design. And those everybody else, you have to be constantly releasing new things for them. And whether that's unlocking concepts where you have something new that you put out over time, whether it's something of the month, of the day, of the week, there's time boxing and there's all sorts of different mechanics you can use to keep the game fresh. And there's constant redesigns based on the data. Data is very important in gamification, because you need to make sure that you're getting the engagement you're seeking, and you're going to learn things about your users. You're going to learn that they engaged in the part of the program you weren't paying attention to all that much, and you're going to need to expand on that. So those are just some of the ideas in terms of how to maintain consistent engagement.
How many of you have ever had a performance review? How many of you actually thought it was fun? Or treated it as a game? Raise your hand. A couple. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting, and forget the benefits example, into performance, and I want to share this back to an example. We did a study with Human Resource Executive magazine. Out of the Fortune 500 organizations, we surveyed 25 people at each organization. And of those 25 people in each organization, 8% said their performance appraisal was something that they paid attention to and found value in. These were of the employees and managers. 8% of the people said they found value in their performance appraisal, which many of us call performance management, which is a nice term for a dumb performance appraisal. What really happened is, as organizations have now started to shift to making those performance management tools online, real-time feedback, badge-based, funified, quote unquote, where I'm actually seeing in real time, one of my colleagues in the back of the room just said they don't like my tie, and I can see that in real time. All of a sudden, that's improving my performance. I'll never wear the tie again when I speak. So when you start to think about that, and you start to think about how do I keep engagement and how do I drive engagement, versus when you think about processes in your organization, a process that's once a year, that pretty much, if Josh said, the only time I'm going to remember anything about Jason is if it happened a week before the review, versus now something that's on. Every single minute I'm capturing something about me and turning it into a bit of a game where I can be comparing my feedback against each other. How many of you like to get good feedback? Anyone? How many of you hate it? And most people like it. So when we get it, it gets us continuing to use it, that continual reinforcement. So, once again, back to the example, 93% of those same people surveyed when they rolled out a tool called Ripple. By the way, Ripple was one of those innovation winners 2 years ago here at the summit. 93% said they actually enjoyed the process and learned from it. So just another example using quantitative numbers of how these types of tools can make a difference.
Great.
I think he was next.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
My name is Michael Krigsman. Have you heard of the use of gamification in trying to run more successful IT projects, which are notoriously prone to failing?
Scrum's not a game?
Might be.
Scrum's a game to me. Think about it. You have players, you have a burn down, right? And everybody's trying to beat the graph. So I think IT is an area where we may not realize it, but we're playing games all day long. We have leaderboards, right? We have support queues, and we have numbers, and we have people with average handle times, and there's a game going on there all day long.
How about in traditional IT approaches rather than Scrum? Any other alternative ideas?
Yeah, I've used it running big development projects, predominantly associated with using game approaches to make performance transparent, and just basically letting people, almost if you will, create the competitive environment that they want to create. So we had one situation where we had a program, we had 14 programming teams were running, and we just put up bar charts, and every Monday and every Wednesday and every Friday we updated the progress against bar charts. Earned value was the primary thing we were using. And what was interesting was we found that it surfaced issues faster because programming teams that were struggling were more willing to ask for help because they perceived that they would be falling behind, as opposed to kind of letting the problem kind of fester and sponsor. So we had to up some of our management support relative to it. And then in some cases, we wound up having to, shall we say, counsel some of the teams, because one of the teams happened, instead of putting up kind of filling in their bar chart like on the local church thermometer thing, they were putting skull and crossbones up there, saying they were killing the functionality, and it was very interesting to see how other people perceived that. But transparency's been something. In a more traditional IT shop, even in a more traditional app dev shop, that can be very, very powerful to really elicit the kind of behavior you want, which is a fundamental engineering behavior, which is I want to surface my problems as quickly as possible, and I want to spread knowledge of them all over the place because somebody's going to help me find and solve those things.
And can you extend that to somehow aligning what IT is doing to the business goals?
Yeah, Michael, one of the things that we've seen used a lot and that we try to use in our deployments and implementations is there was a quote earlier today that was the time between idea and product kills projects, or the chasm gets deeper. I think it might have been to one of your earlier questions, actually, or in the bigger session. One of the things that we try to do, and it's not from the start of the project, but it's ongoing, is how do you raise visibility to projects and the status of projects within organizations. So one of the tools we use is we actually use Yammer for it, which is not a gamification tool necessarily, but it's a feedback tool, it's a thumbs up tool, it's a like tool, where we can actually say, based on the executives we're trying to stay involved in the project, who's liking it, to see that they're actually paying attention to status updates, so that when it comes time to understanding where projects are and decisions where they're at, we can say in a 6 or 9 month deployment of one of these cloud-based tools, there's alignment from the executive level to the project team, and they're watching the decisions being made. So it's not a game per se, but it's collaboration and it's alignment, which is in the form of a game.
Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Sir?
Hi, it's Steve Hill with Pearson. Question for the whole panel. I guess we talked about, perfection's the enemy of done and getting stuff out there, and intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, as well as, badges, leaderboards, these different sort of artifacts in the gamification loop. I'm wondering, to what extent do you spend time either on the front end in design of the gamification loop or on the back end in terms of the assessment of the effectiveness, trying to optimize around different sort of motivators? So like Bartle's gamer DNA type stuff, as in this room probably is very achievement oriented, but that's not necessarily typical of, say, other audiences, say, for example, in your healthcare gamification.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we do is we think of managing the game as more of a co-creative process where, like we were talking about earlier, the game is ever evolving, and it's not like a process where you do it one time and you just let it run. For example, our team-based step challenge, we've changed up that game 3 times in the last year, just based on feedback that we got from the participants. And we take their insight and their wisdom and tweak it just slightly so it refreshes the game when we relaunch it the next time, and then do the same thing again. And I think that's partially why games work. And you're just making that challenge slightly harder that people stay engaged. So the co-creation of it, I think, is what's important and valuable to us.
So I guess just to extend the question maybe a little bit, how much of the feedback is informal versus quantitative?
Yeah, for us right now, the quantitative feedback comes from participation. And when we see that, over 40% of our population participated in the game, making it one of the most popular programs that we had across the board for our wellness initiatives. And then they continue to come back. We've launched the same game with slight tweaks 3 times, and we've continued to have a high success rate. So that to us is a quantitative, it tells us that the game's working. But then feedback more from just people telling us that they're enjoying the game, that they are being motivated, that they're increasing their work, they're happy. We use that as valuable feedback as well.
What I'm going to add is that most organizations have employees that cross 5 generations. And one of the things that's really hard about the concept of gamification is a lot of people say, why in the heck are we rolling out games? Especially when they roll out games. And call them games. So unfortunately, one of the things that we do is clean up a lot of blown up messes around games. And one of the things we try to tell organizations is the technographic of the people that's most important, not the demographic of the people or not the generation that they're in. So back to the measures and how do you measure that pre and post? What we're trying to say is is there even a chance that this is going to be successful? So I've got this great new technology with a bunch of people that don't use Facebook, LinkedIn, or have mobile devices. The chances of a game, even though best designed interactively, it's going to have a hard chance for success unless the delta for change and process management is so deep. So we do a lot of work up front, making sure that the process and change delta is covered, and then at the back end, saying how many people are actually adopting it, realizing that in many workforce-facing processes, I roll them out as HR things. Most of you, when you get an email from HR, what do? Hit delete. Versus how do you actually change it auto-delete. Yeah, it goes to the spam. Versus something that's a workforce-facing tool that's, once again, tied to that perpetual beta. So the measurement of it is the delta sort of between what our expectations were and what it was. There's never that expectation of 100%. But as people buy these tools, if you start with a group of people that have never used anything and virally expand just a little bit, it can have a huge impact.
Terrific. Sir?
Hi, I am Lev Koifman, and my question to the panel. Usually, social games require a significant investment in the infrastructure, like Zynga, significant investment in big data and creative talent. How does it accommodate it in this particular, in your efforts to gamify business processes, like basic business processes like HR, healthcare, etc.? Where do you get funding for that? What is the business model? And how do you retain the talent to? And last question, if I just pack it all together, it doesn't appear to me that these games that you sort of presented here have a social nature. Usually social gaming, it's where participants collaborate, cooperate, compete with each other. Here we kind of have an interaction like peer-to-peer. Not even peer-to-peer, but employee with the website and gets instant gratification as a kind of gamification effort. Can you comment on that?
Jason, you want to take it?
Let's go first.
Sure, I'll start. So real quick, HR organizations, for the most part, can't even count how many employees they have, little less count the value of the interaction of gaming. I hate to say it like that, but that's the way it is. So there's very little big data investments in the world, in my world today, as far as how do I combine social sort of interactions with my traditional HR data to understand business benefit. But where it is, so the answer to your first question is there really hasn't been cases made. But where organizations are focusing on is anything that can raise adoption. So, do you like to pump gas yourself versus having someone do it for you? We've rolled out these dumb things called self-service applications in HR. That how many times a year do you get married? How many times a year do you have a baby? How many times a year do you change your address? Once every 5 years? You don't remember even how to do it during those times. So our example, and what we try to do is get people to drive adoption, A. The second question around interaction is interaction in my era, in my world, in HR, is the next era of knowledge management 2.0. So it's not as much people competing with each other as much as it is people learning from each other and being able to look at the heat maps across the board and say, where are people talking about these areas? So my form of game might be different than what you're talking to, but for me, gaming is understanding where my conversations are happening and then being able to tap that talent.
You mentioned something about investment in infrastructure and creative, and I think it's an important distinction. I'm glad you brought it up. Creating a game in the workplace or for consumers does not have to mean investing heavily in art and level design and character development. Those things need to exist for a traditional game. Yes, they do. And when you see games on Facebook from Zynga and whoever else, that's what they're investing in, and you're 100% right. When you build a game in the enterprise, that game could be as simple as, and I'll go back to my favorite example, taking the sales leaderboard and actually putting it on the intranet. Or taking your compliance training and issuing badges for it. And I'll bet that you have an in-house graphic designer that does something. It might be your annual client newsletter or whatever it is. They can design a badge. There are third parties out there, venture-backed companies, that are in the badging business. They're relatively inexpensive to implement, certainly for an enterprise where you're not targeting millions of consumers. And they come with badges out of the box. So there's a lot of different ways to attack the problem, and badging and leaderboards are just two examples of gamification. But you should think about gamification as a dynamic, not as a piece of software that's huge and expensive to build. You could gamify, by throwing a list up on a bulletin board every day. You don't have to or the bar charts you were talking about.
Right.
It doesn't have to be software.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just give you two examples to your infrastructure question. The Guardian newspapers about 18 months ago, when the Member of Parliament expense scandal hit, and through the British version of the Freedom of Information Act, they dumped literally gigabytes of PDF files, which was the way they were going to do that. For 40 pounds, so about $80, or maybe $100 now, for about 40 pounds, one person built a very simple app that all it did was you checked out a PDF, here was the data set you put it in, you registered, and all they did was literally say who were the people. They had rewards for somebody who posted, you posted your first expense thing into the database, you got a badge. You posted more than 100 pounds, more than 1,000 pounds, you posted, which member of parliament was the first one to get all of their expenses categorized in the database. And it's it can be very, very inexpensive. It's not necessarily all related to things like Zynga or et cetera. And I think the other thing is it's important. Ross Smith at Microsoft has done a lot of work with this, which is to actually add gaming to make work that nobody wants to do a hell of a lot more fun. And so one of the things that Ross and his team did is I don't know if this is great or not, but all the help translation and all the different languages that the help text for Microsoft runs in, that's all created as an open source game where they have people playing different roles. There are people that will take a message and translate it into Czech, and there's other people who speak Czech who actually then validate that it's right. And if 3 people validate it, then it goes up there. And that's all done. They've organized that. You mentioned launching games 3 different times. They launched once as a 64 bracket for the NCAA tournament. They launched it different, as a soccer match. They launched it in different personas, but very, very inexpensive to achieve a significant amount of work. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, Ritu.
Well, I mean, I agree. We use similar strategies as everyone else on the panel has talked about it. I think a game can be as simple as just having the transparency and putting it out on, if you have an internal social media site or an intranet site, just having a lot of people, one of the intrinsic motivators is just being acknowledged and wanting to not be the last one. How many of you want to be the last one in after a race or anything? No one wants to be last. So that in and of itself, if you see your name last, you're going to work a little harder to one up the person that's right there.
Great.
Just want to add, the last thing I'll just say on your big data question, game theory has a ton to do with the future of talent management. And being able to understand how people are interacting with these games and understanding who's got a future leadership capability, who's got a future management capability, who's best at an individual contributor role, who's the best salesperson who's just out to kill the other salespeople and not necessarily be a manager. That has a huge application going forward. We're just not there yet. But you're there. The space isn't quite yet.
And somebody mentioned archetypes, Myers-Briggs. I think we've moved way past that. I don't know that that's a model that we can really. It's a great place to start understanding people as a framework. But I think today, with all of the games that exist in our world, it's not sufficient for modeling the world we live in.
Terrific, sir.
So some games have a component that is very specific to an application domain. So protein folding, for example, or the search for the largest Mersenne prime, I can understand, aren't going to be generalized. But there's a whole lot of other games that can be generalized. So the question becomes, and you alluded to this open source thing just now, so are we at the point where we can start categorizing some of these things into frameworks to allow for this gamification to proceed at a much more accelerated pace? And if not, when might that happen?
Well, I guess, just kind of from a high level perspective, I think we are starting to see, even as the panelists have been discussing, different types of games in terms of, to use your term, Josh, funifying work, that normally would be drudgery, right?
Funification.
Right. Being able to drive, greater degrees of intrinsic benefits. I know there's basically 6, for example, approaches or uses of social media technologies. And I'm sure that you guys, if we all sat down for a few minutes and had a few beers, could probably start to type and group these games. There's compliance games you guys were mentioning. There's active games, et cetera. I don't know if you guys are starting to, as we're talking about this, if you're thinking about there's kind of buckets that you're seeing.
Well, I think for health games, and that in itself, it's its own bucket, and it's kind of new to the playing field, but each day there's new applications and new devices that are getting in on the playing field. So it's hard to say what's best in class right now, but what we are seeing is the ones that are successful are those that have very good, thoughtful game design, and they're intersecting that with behavioral science on motivating factors for health and lifestyle.
I would just say, Ritu and I were talking before, and their whole wellness program is based on people who are out there who have developed solutions for the wellness area. Jason's building a company around gamification for, and among other things, for the HR area. And I would say these are vertical examples. There are also horizontal examples, like the badging companies and the gamification companies. And so I would say those things are happening and they are accelerating the pace. And it's just kind of choose your flavor. Some people like taking a horizontal solution and making it work for them. Some people like to adopt a somewhat proven vertical solution. And so, I think we're there, it's happening.
And I think it's not a peanut butter spread. I mean, if I can think of a couple, just General Mills. Someone go apply for a job on General Mills. General Mills' career site had a 70% abandonment rate. In the middle of applying for a job, people would drop off because it was so bad. You didn't say that, I said that, but whatever the word you said, it was hard. It was work no one wanted to do. What they basically did is they changed it where you picked which cereal character you were most like. Frankenberry, Honey Nut Cheerio Bee, Kellogg's Cheerio, or Kellogg's Tony the Tiger, et cetera, et cetera. You played this little game, and at the end of it, it actually said which jobs you'd be best for at General Mills. They went from a 70% abandonment rate to a 3% abandonment rate. And not only did it help, not only did they think of it as a game, the people actually stayed on the site. Safeway did the same thing with meat and cheese. If you actually ordered meat, the person behind the counter said, "Do you want cheese with that?" Behind the counter, cheese has a 70% profit margin. Off the peg, it has a 3% profit margin. They gamified that whole process and basically said, every time you sell cheese with meat, you're going to get 50 cents plus another point. They used that point to determine performance and tie it back to pay for performance concepts. So there's lots of examples. The question is there a framework? I don't know if we answered that question or not.
I think there are the 6 characteristics, Josh, that you were talking about. And then I think those characteristics manifest themselves in different formats with different levels of intensity for different outcomes that we've been talking about all along.
And there are 4 basic gamification concepts out there. There are 4 people who have published books on gamification with their own structures. And there are startups out there that have modeled themselves after one or several of them. And so, there definitely are frameworks. There's more than one. But in financial services and healthcare, there's more than one. So,
And I think also it's important to remember that part of the reason we're moving into gamification is we want to go outside of the box. So when we're talking about framework, it still puts you inside of a box. But what we're finding is what motivates people is always changing. So there's no one size fits all, at least when it comes to health games. Some people are driven by wanting to exercise, the thrill of just being out there and exercising, they're all for it. But others want the monetary incentive reward. Others want to see their name up on a leaderboard. Others want, a badge. Just a simple piece of paper with a green belt on it will motivate them to do something that seems to be hard work. Mm-hmm. So I think games are beginning to kind of target that area of having multiple solutions.
Sir?
Hi, Dror Schmerling, Eisenberg School of Management. My question is about competitive games. I mean, winning is a great motivator, but it can also drive the wrong behavior. People cheat, people put too many resources on winning rather than doing the job, and so on. How do we avoid it?
The dark side.
Gaming the system is what we call it, right?
Yep. Gaming the system.
So actually, in a health and wellness application, there were a couple of insurance companies that were running a compliance program to try and get patients to comply with ongoing treatment. And there were patients who were effectively figuring out how to not do the treatment, but to get the points. And they were figuring out that they could actually get more points each day than they were supposed to be allocated. And so it's a problem. When you design your game, you need to design it such that it's not rewarding the wrong behaviors. If you're when you're designing the feedback loops, you need to make sure that your feedback loops are feeding back on the right activities. And there's ways to do that where if you have one feedback loop that's going to potentially be overused, you can create another feedback loop to sort of counterbalance that. So an example would be if you're providing a point system and people are ultimately earning a certain level of points, you can give them a badging system for coming back every day so that even if they win a ton of points in one day, they're not going to get that badge any more than after the first X number of points in a day.
Ralph Lancelota, a media advisory partners. You know, there's nothing new in the world. It's always just kind of reformatted in that. But years ago, there was a company in Connecticut called Glendenning. I don't know if probably no one here has heard of them, but it was some guys out of P&G. And they actually applied this idea of creating games for consumer packaged goods companies and gas stations, grocery stores. And they hired very smart people and great salesmen. And the company went up like a rocket, and then it kind of disappeared. And the people went on to great jobs. And I think it's closer to what their focus was more like Jason. I think the technology has changed, but the idea is the same. And of course, anybody that's run a sales organization, that's been almost since the beginning of time to have this what we call games now. I almost think personally that gamification, or fun, whatever it was, is really almost a fad-oriented kind of phrasing. I think Jason's really hit it. It's engagement. And I think the idea of self-designed goals is somewhat new. But I think it's the technology, and the person asked about the framework. I believe if the companies in this business do not focus on developing the framework so it has somewhat of a research foundation to it, or I don't know if use the word scientific, I think it's going to go the way. I mean, this is not new to have companies like this and say, well, we'll make it a game. You know, Publishing Clearinghouse was really a game. Now, they had their other legal problems, right?
Well,
So-
green stamps,
Right.
a lot of things have been games,
Exactly.
yes.
So my only point is I'm concerned when I hear this, and except Jason makes me feel a little better in that it's engagement, it's this time lapse, it's the real-time posting, and then I think what you're doing in healthcare, setting your own goals, but in a team environment. So anyway, a little comment that I'm a little concerned about the word game.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, for us in the wellness world, you know, engagement is a part of it. You can't really drive the behavior change if people aren't engaging in the programs. But what we're really going for is changing the behavior. You know, if people are just participating in the program, but they're still having their high blood pressure, overweight, you know, having these conditions, the game's not working. So yes, a big part of it is using the game to engage people, making health more fun. And ultimately, if the behavior is being done, the outcomes will follow.
The question was, do you use the word game inside as you're talking inside Blue Shield or with your clients? Do you really talk about games, or you talk about, you know, facilities or things to achieve a particular outcome?
We don't really say it's gamification, but we have a step challenge. We call it a step challenge. We don't call it a step game. But the idea, the theory that's used in it is a gamification theory. A new one that we've had recent success with is the Daily Challenge by MIU Health. And again, it's a game. You're getting badges, you're getting points, you're getting rewards. Those are all game components. But it's driving behavior change, ultimately.
To steal a marketing term, when you are trying to get your audience engaged, you're going to create a call to action, right? You're going to try and give them a compelling reason to come and do it. You're not going to say to them, hey, come play this game. You're going to say, come do the daily challenge. You're going to say, come fill out this form and get your thing, right? Whatever the call to action is, you want to articulate what's the expected behavior, what's the value.
No, I don't. I agree, sir.
Yeah, I think if I could, and just back to what I think real quick, because
we've got time for we got two more people with questions.
I don't think it's a different concept. I think what technology allows you to do today better than ever before is to embed the concept of a game or collaboration or engagement into an existing process. And instead of it being something separate, it allows you to do it together. And I think that's the difference. A game in one site and a process in another site, people aren't going to think of it as one. That's what happened at P&G. Here I'm embedding it as part of a process and thinking of it as collaboration.
And I think the other big thing that is different, or potentially is putting this all in new clothes, is that the old means of playing quote unquote the game was a form of coercion and control from a degree of management saying thou shalt do this, and really the game was at the manager level to get compliance of the staff. And I think what we're really talking about is, and you've heard this word used multiple times, is intrinsically driving those things forward, and then being able to create the mechanisms, to your point about the dark side of gaming, to be able to create the mechanisms to reward intrinsic rewards and make intrinsic rewards more valuable in an organization, as opposed to being it 10, 15, 20 years ago. It was only the suckers that did things for all the right reasons, or the people that really believed in our culture, but I'll go out and do something different. And I think the means have changed. I think the ends are probably pretty much the same. We just have time for just 2 real quick questions, because I do want to leave some time for some closing comments for the panelists. Sir?
Hi, Mike Rehorst from Northwestern Mutual. Can you comment on the use of games to drive innovation? And perhaps are there unique challenges with that type of usage versus trying to drive a behavior change that we've been talking about?
Okay, great.
So starting with innovation, I mean, really what we see organizations doing from an innovation standpoint is actually making sure that there's feedback, and I'll just tie that back to feedback mechanisms available for people to be able to, no matter where they are, any place, anytime, anywhere, make a statement, get feedback on it, and share that. And use tags or use some sort of a common content theme to be able to tie that together. And make that searchable across an enterprise, so that I can actually see there's these people talking about gamification in this context in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and everyone thinks it's a bunch of bull, so we're going to forget about it. No, just kidding. But make sure that there's these constant discussion threads that are out there, and not necessarily keeping score, back to that winner or loser concept, but making sure there's a way out there to reward people with feedback, with recognition, to get them commenting. Once again, it's the feedback and recognition that matters. It's not who wins and loses. As for me in an industry where I'm always doing everything for the 0.1%, not for the 99.9% that are good. HR, we're always scared of everything. If anything I can do to just make sure people have an open ability to dialogue and interact, to me that's where this gaming and feedback comes into play.
Great.
I hate to tie it back to plumbing, but ultimately you have a behavior that you're trying to incent. You're going to have feedback loops, and those feedback loops are going to incentivize more behavior or less behavior, depending on your goal. When you talk about innovation,
go ahead.
Just very quickly, when you talk about innovation, one of Jason mentioned it, recognition, making people's innovations visible to their peers. In many cases, that works very well. Making people's feedback on the innovation, their peers' feedback on the innovation visible, is generally a way to get them the positive feedback intrinsically within the system. The feedback from their peers is intrinsically valued by them, and so all you're basically doing is making that visible and making it transparent, and that tends to work. But innovation is just yet another thing that we're trying to incentivize a behavior with the right feedback loops.
And I think one thing you don't see a lot of is you don't see contests. So whether you think about the different X Prize challenges or the contests that are up on Topcoder or some of these other 99 designs, et cetera, it's just another example of the application of these principles to discovering and creating something new. Sir, one final question, please.
Sure. Matt Ferguson. I work for a OD and training company focused in PM. Big on badging, big on leaderboards, get it all the time. Question is, if I'm bribing, to use a dirty word, behavior change, I question sustainability. Is it fair to judge the effectiveness of a game on sustained behavior once we take the game away versus the uptick in behavior during the presence of the game? And is there any insight into what the absence of a game is going to do in terms of sustaining that behavior, so I don't have to keep paying 50 cents per slice of cheese,
right,
or having the up team or something.
That was the essence of the crusty old man question. I just didn't say it as well as you did.
Well, I think from the wellness perspective, I think we can all kind of relate to this. If you start exercising, you start seeing the scale numbers move, the weight's coming off, you're more likely to stick to that program. So even though I don't I don't think of our games and our programs as bribing. It is a co-creative process. We are taking feedback from our employees, participants, and using that as we kind of redesign, relaunch our games. But really, we're supporting the behavior change. And we can see by people continuing to come back to play these games, participate in the step challenge multiple times in a year, even though they've earned their incentive, they've earned their rewards, there's a stickiness there that says that it is sustainable. And it's beyond just the rewards. It is tapping into these intrinsic motivators that keeps them coming back.
Bribing inherently is extrinsic, and so I don't think that is effective gamification. You know, bribing will work for a very short amount of time and incent a very finite amount of behavior. Gamification is really about creating an engagement loop where you have a long-term process that you're trying to incentivize, and just like Ritu said, I think, you know, depending on the type of game and the type of behavior you're incentivizing, if there's intrinsic value that exists that will continue to exist, whether it's the wellness example or the Bing example, right, where you're able to learn how to use Bing more effectively, and so you're going to do more searches, and that becomes a tool that's useful to you. So if it's intrinsically valuable consistently and you're able to continue to perceive that value without the game, yeah, you'll probably get consistent engagement over time. Depending on what other factors exist in that person's world, it's not perfect, and the game certainly helps sustain it. But you know, it's providing the intrinsic feedback loops, the occasional extrinsic feedback loop, and I would say, you know, bribing is going to give you a very short-lived result.
Yeah, you guys, it's a culture. It's not this is a culture. This is once you start watering the plant, you have to keep watering the plant. The minute you stop watering the plant, it dies. You know, and if you're just going to do things on an on and off basis, every time you start, adoption's going to keep getting lower and lower and lower every time. So it has to be something driven by the business. It has to be something driven through the culture of the company. It has to be something from the time that someone applies through the time that they leave, and there's that culture throughout. If it's just a one-off thing that doesn't match the culture of the company, or it starts and stops, it will die fast. It's not sustainable.
And I think Jason just hit on a really important point. Anytime you talk about behavior and behavior change, whether it's social media or the application of these principles to work and processes, if it's inconsistent with the culture and values of the organization, then you do have to resort to bribing, which definitely is not sustainable. But unfortunately, in the game that we're playing against the clock, it looks like the clock is going to win. If you could please put your hands together and thank our panelists.